I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today I'm asking, is Robert Malone the Zelensky of the COVID con? And I'm going to look in detail at the Project Veritas leak. And as you can tell by my air quotes, as a spoiler alert, I think that removed the last shred of doubt that was in my mind about whether Robert is on our side or the other side. That also calls into question pretty much everyone he's associated with. Not to say, oh, this person is controlled opposition, but to say, are they being used or are we being used? And in order to answer those questions, I'm going to look at what's the end game. And let's put in a hypothesis about the end game so that then we can look at where people stand in terms of the goal. To do that, I'll be looking at something called Gigaohm Biologic, which is a guy I think named JJ, which is on Twitch TV, and looking at his analysis and then going from there and asking more geopolitical questions using the research of Matt Ehret. Let's do this. I'm sure that all of you have seen the video, probably more than I have, so I won't go into too much detail, but the first part I want to look at is the science part of it. It is a goofy young guy who is being shot from below on a secret camera, and he is bragging about what Pfizer has done from his position as a supposed R&D executive for Pfizer, how they have been mutating the virus. Now, Sasha Latapova has a post. She does Due Diligence and Art, which is an excellent site. And what she wrote was, OMG, Pfizer is mutating COVID, with 3 exclamation points. So if that wasn't enough of a clue, what she writes is, the perpetrators of this psyops desperately, at all cost, need you to believe that mutating viruses in a lab achieves some scary result that then can be leaked, that anyone can do it, even a PhD student in their garage, that our enemies are doing it and will release a super scary bug anytime now, unless the government is prepared by making a stockpile of predictive vaccines that can be deployed in days after a new scary virus is detected in China or Timbuktu. In the video, the goofy actor, because that's what we should call him, and I don't know, he may be actually a much more credible person in real life, but the person he was playing was goofy and supposedly drunk, supposedly not too bright. And so he goes on to say, oh, look at this. We put it in some monkeys and then we waited to see like who ended up getting the worst virus. And then we let that mutate over and let them infect some other monkeys. And he's saying this as if we should believe this when the last vaccine I thought was released with only 8 mice that it was tested on. So you're going through whole life cycles of entire zoos worth of monkeys just to see what happens in nature that might or might not be able to transfer to humans? That is so absurd that I can't believe anyone is believing it who's thought about this for a while. But then the video that JJ shows is one in which first Steve Kirsch and Robert Malone are talking on a conference call. And they're talking about, oh, can you believe this video? And isn't that just what Pfizer does? And how absurd that they would hire people like this, but that's just what happens these days. And they're talking about the entire thing at face value, as if that was all real. So that alone removed any shred of doubt for me, because no one who really even looks at it logically could believe what that guy was saying. And then Robert Malone goes on Tucker Carlson, and that's the next call that he has after this conference call. And so he's on Tucker Carlson and he's saying, yes, that guy, he had no morals. Isn't that awful? And talks about how they're releasing viruses, which, like this last one, could killed millions of people. So he's talking about COVID as having killed millions of people, not remdesivir and the lockdowns and all the preventing people from getting things like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. He doesn't talk about any of those things. He talks about the virus as having killed millions. And he goes on to position this as something that is a problem with Pfizer, is a problem with the CDC. But he doesn't see any deeper problem with that narrative. JJ then goes into why the entire gain of function narrative is a psyops. And I believe that he is a former biology professor. I don't know the science that he is talking about, but there definitely is a lot of logic to it. It's something that is worth a closer look. And I recommend that everyone check out the Substack on this episode, where I will have the link to that, because it's really worth understanding his argument fully. Not entirely different from what Sasha is saying, that what we're being set up for is this: we have to be ready with the Department of Defense funding these defensive biological weapons, which once again is what Robert Malone was involved in. That's who he worked for. So then JJ shows the second video that was released later. At this point, we have hypothetically Project Veritas being set up by someone who is pretending to release some bombshell that is then going to let some people off the hook and put others on it. So that's what we know so far. Then we have the second video. And in the second video, the Project Veritas cohort comes out from the back carrying his laptop, which has the only copy of this interview, and confronts the actor and says, "Why are you doing this gain of function, and do you really think that's moral?" And the guy goes ballistic and he starts saying, "No, I was just trying to impress my date, and I don't feel very good about this, and you're not allowed to do this." And he calls the police and says, "There's too many white people around. I don't feel safe." And if you just haven't seen it, he is gay and also a person of color. So that's where those things come in. And then he starts attacking the person and violently trying to grab their laptop. And in the final scene, I think he's out in front of the restaurant and he is flagging down and standing in front of cars to try to intercept whoever has that laptop and get it back. Really? You're going to have a journalist who goes undercover and gets away with it and so decides to blow their cover by coming out of the shadows with a computer that happens to have the only existing copy of that incriminating interview. I'm sure that would work with the mafia, right? Generally, that's how undercover operations go. You just do this little confrontation at the end just to see what their reaction's going to be. That is the stupidest thing that I have ever seen, to try to convince anybody that this was for real. Come on, people. You can't be falling for that. So at this point, we know Project Veritas is in on it. It's staged. All of this is staged. And who is it staged for? How many dog whistles did we have in there for the anti-woke population? We have the fact that he's on a gay date. We have the fact that he's a person of color who's been promoted to this very high-level job, but he's obviously no professional and just got there because of that. And then you've got him calling and saying, "There's too many white people around. I don't feel safe." It is such a shout out to whoever wants to believe that narrative. It has no credibility whatsoever. So what is the end game? What's the agenda? The reason for my title is that Zelensky is an actor whose role is to stir up anti-Russia hatred. Is the agenda of Malone to turn us against China? That's what Matt Ehret looked at in his article, "Why is Robert Malone Spreading Anti-China Misinformation?" That was referring to a guest post that had been put on there by Claire Lopez back in October. And that was a time when I still was taking Robert Malone at face value. I was still a big fan of his. But this article raised a lot of antenna for me. And so I found, looking back at the comments on that although Malone had unsubscribed me, he had not deleted my past comments. So I could find where I wrote, "I'm sorry, Dr. Malone, but this reads like U.S. propaganda to me by the standards that you've established elsewhere and the rhetorical devices you've outlined. It makes general claims of motives and cites a history as it's been taught in the U.S. It also comes at a time when the U.S. is doing blatantly antagonistic things like Pelosi and Taiwan to ramp up public outrage and support for a war against China. There are credible hypotheses with evidence that the Wuhan strain was spread from Fort Detrick in your and my neck of the woods through infected soldiers in war games simultaneous to the outbreak. And didn't a study just come out showing it originated in Chapel Hill, North Carolina?" That this article starts with her title of "China's Drive for Global Hegemony." I point out that while the U.S. has over 800 different bases in other people's countries, China, I think, might have 2, if I'm remembering Matt's research. Or maybe it was that China has 2 labs of biological research, while the U.S., we know, has ones in our own country and scattered around the world, including around Ukraine, because that was one of the major issues to look at, whether those were developing ethnically targeted ones that would be able to affect Russian origin and not other people. So that was one of the first hints that I had. And Claire Lopez used words like Lebensraum. And so having a word that goes back to Nazi Germany, that she's making that analogy that China is just like Nazi Germany. That to me was so very strange that I think it's worth looking at another agenda. In my last video, Did Fascists Win World War II? I looked at whether we have not been told the truth about that war, and that, as always, history is written by the winners. So what I look is whether there were two competing forms of royalty, that you had the European royalty, who looked at it from bloodlines, and then you had the religious royalty, who were the Zionists, and who also had control of the money system. And that what was done was using Germany in the middle, that Germany was a pawn the same way that Ukraine is now a pawn, and that those two sets of people who believed that they should each have one ring to rule them all were fighting over who actually had the right to rule. So in this same way, I think it's possible that we're being played again. That if you look at Robert Malone's anti-China information, there is also this part that compares to Nazi Germany and the whole dissent controversy, that's what he does again and again and again, is he goes back and says, this is just like Nazi Germany. We have to make sure that we don't end up like Nazi Germany. So what does that do? That puts us in a place where any kind of protest is seen as on the slippery slope towards the anti-Semitism that led to Nazi Germany, that those two things are intertwined. And while we can talk about the Russians and the Chinese all day and all night, as if the country and all the people in it were a single homogeneous entity that acts with one will, you can never talk about Israel or the Jews as if they even exist. You can't identify someone as being part of that. Isn't that what Oprah ended up getting penalized for, saying that it was a nationality? So we've been put into this place where anti-Semitism, making sure that that is not part of the discussion, that there is no discussion at all of banks and money, because that's just another secret way of revealing ourselves to be anti-Semitic, that you can't talk about people like the Rothschilds. That history is disappeared. And so we end up having a situation where, for instance, we are perhaps going to be promoting someone for president whose uncle did set up Israel. And people like Vera Shiraz are major voices in this, who's just come out with a documentary, once again comparing what's happening now to Nazi Germany. So I think that that's another part of this puzzle that we need to pay attention to. I'll end by talking about some comments that I posted in a thread on Jessica Rose's Unacceptable Jessica. Jessica recently appeared at the Stockholm conference along with Robert Malone, and there was some altercation at the end that I don't know the details of. But my guess would be that it probably was some confrontation of Robert Malone. And what she was saying was, in the game of snakes and ladders, choose the ladders, row your own boat, go towards what you believe to be the truth, I think is what she's saying, and leave the rest alone. So her talking about unity made me right, but I don't know whether unity is always a good strategy. That unity through a common purpose is a long, hard slog. The cheap and easy way that people achieve unity is through a common enemy or someone who we're all better than. And those are tricks that you may end up, if someone isn't really who they say they are, you may end up having to either agree with something that you don't feel right about, or at that point say, okay, I've been promoted by someone who now is being discredited. And is that going to discredit me too? So I love Jessica. I think she is totally on the up and up. And I also love Lena. So those are two people that I just want to say I'm casting no aspersions on, other than, are we being used? Are good people being used? So in those comments, someone said, well, you should look at Bret Weinstein because he and his wife Heather talk about Robert Malone and the whole Project Veritas. So I watched the excerpt that he sent, and in it, Bret and Heather go through the science of it, and they also debunk the science. And they say that maybe Omicron was something that did get released that way, and they were trying to actually create something that would be another vaccine, but somehow it escaped, and then it self-vaccinated everyone. And so it was an interesting discussion on that. But then Bret says, at first I had my doubts about whether this was a setup, but when I saw the second portion where he is confronted and goes ballistic, then I knew it was true, because that's what this woke ideology does. It puts people like that in positions of power where they can influence us and the whole world. So Bret, of course, does have an anti-woke chip on his shoulder. That was a confrontation where he ended up being let go from the university, and then I think sued them, and I think got quite a good settlement from that. So that's a big issue of his. But that to me says that Bret and Heather are either willing to be fooled and be gullible to say that, yes, this confrontation was real, and come on, the thing was not even well acted or well scripted. You have to take off all critical thinking in order to have believed it. And so I think that that is another sign that Bret, as the person who first interviewed Robert Malone and Steve Kirsch and brought them into prominence, is another person who has to be on my watch list. But to show that I didn't always feel that way, here's one of the first videos that I made called The Demonization and Demonetization of Disinformation on Bret Weinstein. And then here is a playlist that is on propaganda and censorship, because I think we all need to up our game. Thank you.